So this is the boss in my game. Yeah, it's just a block. Let's fix that. Hi everyone and welcome back to another Sewer Oasis devlog. For those of you new to the channel, Sewer Oasis is a Metroidvania game I'm working on in the Bevy game engine. In this devlog, I added the game's first real boss fight as well as an actual starting area. You may have noticed that the game looks quite different from last devlog. Don't worry, this is just a different area of the game. As for the player, you may have noticed he looks a little bit different too. He's a bit smaller and no longer carries the sword at the beginning of the game. All of these are little tiny details that I've tweaked since the last devlog. To give some context, in the last devlog, we improved the game feel and look of our game a lot. And in this devlog, I decided to take a break from implementing the game's core systems and to begin working on some gameplay. I figure I deserved a break considering the almost 2,000 lines of code that I wrote to improve the game's core systems and game feel without much gameplay that I've added since the first devlog. And although that may not seem like a lot, it certainly took a toll on me, so I decided to do something fun for this devlog. To create a boss fight, we first have to conceptualize what the boss is going to do. So let's start working on the boss behaviors. But I think we need to take a step back. In order to create a good and memorable boss fight, we have to analyze what makes a good boss. Take Hollow Knight for example, because it is a game that in my opinion has some of the best bosses I've faced in any game, and also has them in a large enough quantity which will be easy for us to analyze. Let's start off with some of the examples of bad bosses in Hollow Knight. Marshmellow is a really good example of a badly designed boss. This boss only has one attack and is very inconsistent to deal with. It feels like the velocity at which he moves is randomized and you can't really do much once he starts bouncing like a madman off the walls. So basically what I'm trying to say is that the fight should not rely on randomness and unpredictability, and that it should have a multitude of attacks and not just one attack. You can see that if you haven't trained to fight this boss, you pretty much just face tank it. Marshmellow is also another extremely hated boss in Hollow Knight. This boss only has 2 attacks and is one of the most hated bosses in the game. Although most people really hate the version of his fight when there is no floor in the fight, the rest of the fight still does deserve some criticism. Right away you can probably tell why people don't like this boss just by looking at this gameplay. The fact that his attacks spawn in a random location means you have to be extremely careful when fighting him. Furthermore, his second attack is extremely flawed. It's very hard to predict where his shield will spin and whether you get hit or not. Overall, I think that this fight relies a lot on trial and error because though the attacks seem to be easy to dodge, you might get randomly hit by a sword spawning in your path of movement, a sword that spawned off your screen, or even his shields that are extremely hard to predict. I think a lesson that we can take from this fight is again to not rely on RNG and to minimize the unfairness of your attacks while also trying to design the fight around telegraphs and not trial and error. This boss really tests the resilience of your player, and this is a boss that I've spent quite a large amount of time practicing, and you can see that I still got hit a lot. Although I actually started liking this boss quite a bit, you can really tell that it has a flawed design. Now let's finally take a look at some good bosses in Hollow Knight. A boss that I consider to be particularly good is the Pure Vessel. This boss has a variety of attacks and is relatively difficult for most players, but it generally is a very well designed boss. You can see that once you get good at the fight, you pretty much don't get hit and can often get more hits in by optimizing your movement and attacks in this fight. However, it's not extremely easy once you master it either. You might still trip up due to the minimal telegraphs and fullness of the screen that this boss creates between some of its attacks, so you still have to try very hard to beat this boss. Although you can't really predict what the boss is going to do next, this fight is extremely fair. It allows players to beat it through skill and reaction time. Many people don't like this boss because it is a hard boss despite the really good design, but that just means the devs did a good job because this is one of the last bosses in a game. For instance, I can't really find any specific instance where the boss uses any RNG that doesn't give the player an opportunity to dodge it. This is one of my favorite bosses in the game and we can definitely learn from its design. And because I don't want this entire video to be talking about Hollow Knight bosses, I'm going to stop talking about them at this point and start creating the behaviors for my boss. So my concept for how my boss is going to move is that it's going to be an enemy that floats and changes directions when it hits each side of the arena. So I moved the boss a little bit up to simulate floating and removed the gravity which affects the boss. But you can see that my knockback system which I implemented last video really isn't cutting it for this boss. So first I made my knockback system more robust and customizable by making it a component and system instead of hard coding it into the player component. You can see that the player and the boss are both being pushed in different directions while also maintaining predictable behavior. Speaking of which, you can see that I've made an AI system for the boss by using enums as states. Currently it's very simple and only contains a dormant and move state right now, but that's because we haven't added any attacks yet. The dormant state is what the boss will be like when the player hasn't discovered them yet. I'll probably play a sleep animation or make a silhouette to get the player curious, and when they get close, the boss will start attacking them. Then the boss will transition into a move state, which will make him move between the left and right side of the arena, changing directions when he hits the walls. He will periodically stop to pick from a random list of attacks that the player must avoid. You can see that I left some room for fighting optimization, as you can sometimes hit the boss 2 times in one jump. Okay, now that we have the basic movement behavior of the boss, let's get started on making some attacks for the boss. So it seems every time I try to develop this game, the custom physics system that I built comes back to bite me. While making the projectiles launch as a test, I noticed something funny about my collisions at low frame rates. You clip through the walls as a result of how my collision system handles vertical before horizontal collisions. It's actually quite a difficult problem to solve, and after spending several hours trying to get my collision to resolve at low frame rates, it still didn't work, but I had a general idea of how to fix it, so I shelved the issue in favor of getting this video out in time. Just kidding, I kept working on this issue anyways because I just couldn't stand my game having a broken collision system. You can see that the collision system now works. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's start creating the first attack for our boss. The first attack I added for the boss was just a simple attack where he would launch some drills that home in on the position that you're standing in when the attack is initiated. I have a feeling that this attack might be kind of difficult if it's your first time facing off against the boss, but I'm going to be adding a clear telegraph once we finish prototyping the attacks. This attack doesn't rely on RNG, which is a good thing, and it should be pretty easy and consistent to dodge if you know what you're doing and don't try to get in hits while the boss is attacking. You might also notice that the projectiles don't damage you yet. I'm kind of lazy, so I'm not going to be making a health system for the player in this video, but I will add a knockback indicator when the player is hit. Right away, you can already notice that the attack is a bit difficult to dodge. As is with many things in game development, you fine-tune details as time goes on. I feel like it's more important to just get a framework down for the boss right now. I might even make this boss a later boss in the game instead of the first boss in the game because it doesn't really radiate first boss difficulty for me. In fact, if I decide so, this boss might not even be in the game at all. Everything is subject to change, and if you guys notice something or want to suggest that I add something to the game, I would be really grateful for any suggestions in the comments or my Discord server. I'm getting a bullet hell vibe from this boss, so the next attack I made was this sort of splitter attack that turned into smaller bullets that the player must dodge. Right away, it's kind of obvious that this mechanic violates our RNG principle. This is true and almost undodgeable bullet hell. It reminds me of those Undertale fan games. So instead of making it non-RNG based, I made the attack fairer by modifying some of the speed values of the particles. This definitely violates some of the principles that we reviewed at the start of the video, but this attack in its original state felt semi-avoidable and fun to dodge, so I wanted to capitalize off of that. I made the attack easier by basically modifying attributes of the bullets, such as making them slower and making the original bullets that spawn the smaller bullets home in on the player less. You might not have been able to tell, but the bullets were accelerating towards the player at a semi-unnoticeable rate before they turned into the splitter particles. Now this attack sort of does rely on trial and error because the player won't be able to tell what the attack is going to do, but I plan to compensate for this later in the game by subtracting a lesser amount of HP from the player when getting hit by these splitter particles. Alright, so since I think that the boss is already difficult enough as is, we will leave the moveset at that. Time to make sprites and add a little bit of game juice to the boss before we end the video. I opted to go for a robot because it's the only thing that would make sense to be launching drills and splitter grenade thingies at the player. This is the final result. I added some camera shake, and I think it's a pretty rough approximation of what I want the final boss fight to look like. This is just the first iteration of the boss. I could probably tune the attacks of the boss much more and add particles in post-processing to make the fight look better, but I think this is where we will end the video. I hope all of you enjoyed, and make sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss these devlogs.